June 1st, 2025, a seemingly ordinary date that may mark a fundamental turning point in humanity's nuclear age. On this day, Ukraine's security service executed a covert operation codenamed Web, using modified container trucks to transport drones deep into Russian territory, launching precision strikes against multiple strategic bomber bases and Russia's core strategic assets. The tactical details were remarkable. Drone swarms deployed like a spider's web, targeting Russian strategic bombers parked at their bases. While sources differ on the number of aircraft destroyed, ranging from 4 to 41, one fact remains undeniable. This attack struck at the very heart of Russia's nuclear deterrence system. Even more significant are reports suggesting British intelligence services were deeply involved in planning and executing this operation. From a purely military perspective, Operation Web was undoubtedly a bold, innovative, and successful special operation. However, when we elevate our perspective to examine the historical implications of this event, a disturbing conclusion emerges. The era of normalized nuclear weapons use may now be inevitable. To understand the historical significance of Operation Web, we must return to the nuclear deterrence logic established during the Cold War. In that era of peace under the shadow of death, strategic assets like nuclear bombers were considered absolute no-go zones. This wasn't because they were technically impossible to attack, but because attacking such targets would trigger uncontrollable nuclear escalation risks. This taboo was built on the cold logic of mutual assured destruction, MAD. Any attack on nuclear assets, regardless of the means employed, was considered part of nuclear warfare. This deterrent balance maintained relative stability for decades, and even during the most intense geopolitical conflicts, all parties strictly observed this invisible red line. However, on June 1st, 2025, this red line was definitively crossed. Ukraine and its Western allies chose to attack Russia's core strategic assets using conventional means, fundamentally challenging the basic principles that had maintained nuclear-age stability. This was not merely a military operation, but a direct challenge to the entire nuclear deterrence system. Facing this unprecedented challenge, Russia finds itself trapped in a complex strategic dilemma. Let us analyze 3 possible response pathways and the potentially catastrophic consequences of each. Russia might choose to retaliate through conventional military means, launching larger-scale conventional strikes against Ukraine. However, this response faces a fundamental problem. Given that Russia is already conducting massive conventional bombardments of Ukraine, can purely conventional retaliation send a sufficiently strong signal? Reviewing previous escalation patterns. When Ukraine used Western-supplied long-range missiles to attack targets within Russian territory, Russia responded with strategic ballistic missiles carrying conventional warheads. But the implementation of Operation Web clearly demonstrates that the West and Ukraine did not view this response as a deterrent signal worth respecting. More critically, since the Russia-Ukraine war is essentially a proxy conflict, whether the decision to attack Russian nuclear assets stems from Ukraine's independent will or from directives by Western decision-makers behind the scenes remains questionable. Under these circumstances, even if Russia chooses to attack Ukrainian leadership, or even Zelensky himself, it may fail to convey a deterrent message to the real decision-makers. The failure of conventional retaliation would lead to 2 dangerous consequences. First, Ukraine might become even bolder in attacking Russian nuclear assets, continuing until Russia either capitulates or is forced to use nuclear weapons. Second, this would create a dangerous precedent. Any nation or organization might conclude that using non-nuclear means to attack nuclear powers' nuclear assets is acceptable. Imagine such a future: Iran attacking Israel's nuclear facilities, Taiwan striking China's nuclear submarine bases, or even terrorist organizations attacking nuclear facilities on American soil. Once this pattern of attack becomes normalized, eventually one will trigger a nuclear power's nuclear retaliation, thus opening Pandora's box of practical nuclear weapons use. Russia's second option is to conduct limited, controlled nuclear retaliation. For example, selecting a Ukrainian military or industrial target far from civilians and, with prior warning, striking it with a low-yield nuclear weapon. This response seems capable of conveying a clear message. Attacking Russian nuclear assets will inevitably trigger nuclear response. Theoretically, this might force Western decision-makers and the Ukrainian government to reconsider their strategy, returning the world to the Cold War's nuclear terror balance. However, the concept of limited nuclear use itself is fraught with danger. First, it would break the nuclear non-use taboo maintained worldwide since Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Once this taboo is broken, the threshold for nuclear weapons use will dramatically lower, and nuclear weapons will inevitably appear in more nations and conflicts in the future. More seriously, Russia's nuclear retaliation would likely trigger strong reactions from NATO, particularly Britain, France, and Germany. These nations might become deeply involved in the Russia-Ukraine war, directly deploying troops to Ukraine, establishing no-fly zones, and engaging in direct confrontation with Russian forces. The United States, which had maintained relative restraint, would also become deeply bound to this conflict. Under such circumstances, the world would immediately slide toward the abyss of World War III. And with nuclear weapons already having been used practically, World War III would very likely ultimately evolve into full-scale nuclear warfare. Russia's third option is to bypass Ukraine as a proxy and issue an ultimatum directly to the real Western decision-makers. For example, declaring to Britain, either immediately cease all support to Ukraine or Russia will declare war on Britain, essentially declaring war on all of NATO. This strategy is reminiscent of America's approach during the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis. Either the Soviet Union withdraws missiles from Cuba or face full-scale nuclear war. At that time, the Soviet Union ultimately chose to back down. If Russia adopts a similar strategy today, there could be two outcomes. Either the West retreats in the face of nuclear threats, stops aid to Ukraine, leading to Ukraine's rapid defeat, or the West accepts the challenge, with the entire Western world entering a state of total war with Russia, essentially the eve of nuclear war. But this strategy is equally fraught with risk. If Russia ultimately doesn't dare follow through on its threats, Putin's government will suffer fatal damage to its credibility, and domestic politics might become destabilized. Once Russia's nuclear deterrent is proven to be bluffing, the West and Ukraine might become even bolder in attacking Russian nuclear assets, potentially extending this model to confrontations with other nuclear powers like China. Conversely, if Russia honors its commitment, the world will immediately enter a state of nuclear warfare. Through the above analysis, we can reach a shocking conclusion. Regardless of which response path Russia chooses, Operation Web will very likely become a landmark event marking humanity's entry into the nuclear warfare era. The far-reaching impact of this operation extends far beyond the scope of the Russia-Ukraine war. It marks the beginning of the collapse of the nuclear deterrence system that has been maintained for nearly 80 years, signaling the end of the peace under the shadow of death era. We are witnessing a historical turning point, a transition from the era of nuclear weapons as deterrent tools to the era of nuclear weapons as battlefield weapons. The implications of this transformation will be global. Other nuclear powers, the United States, China, Britain, France, India, Pakistan, Israel, will all be forced to reassess their nuclear strategies. Non-nuclear nations might accelerate their nuclear weapons development programs, because in a world where nuclear weapons might be used conventionally, nuclear deterrent capability becomes even more important. We may be entering a new historical period, an era where nuclear weapons are no longer the last resort but potentially usable in conventional conflicts, an era where nuclear deterrence fails and the spectre of nuclear war looms over the globe. Operation Web on June 1, 2025, appears on the surface to be a clever military operation, but in essence may represent the end of humanity's peaceful era. What this operation destroyed was not merely several strategic bombers, but the nuclear taboo that has maintained world stability for nearly 80 years. We stand at a crossroads of history. The path ahead is filled with unknowns and dangers, but one thing is certain. The golden age of nuclear deterrence is drawing to a close, and a more dangerous, more unpredictable new era is approaching. At this critical moment, Understanding the profound implications of this change is more important than focusing on the specific details of the operation, because what we are witnessing is not merely a military action, but an important turning point for human civilization. This is the History and Weapons channel. Facing such a historic moment, each of us should consider, in a world where nuclear weapons might become normalized for use, how should humanity survive and develop? Please share your thoughts and concerns in the comments below. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time.